in our terroirs, in our soils. As coffee growers, we have so much life, so much microbiology that you can do great things within your own terroir before you look out.
This is Keys to the Shop, episode 560, and today we're talking with Felipe Sardi of La Palma y el Tucán in Cundinamarca, Colombia. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show, of course, and happy to have you along today. If you're new to the show, I would invite you to explore the episodes over on our website, keystotheshop.com, but better yet, just get subscribed. If you're not new to the show, but you listen all the time and you're not subscribed, now's the time to do that. Just hit subscribe wherever you are listening to your podcast. You can follow along on YouTube as well. You can see these episodes. The interviews of our guests are on video, also on YouTube. So go check that out at Keys to the Shop and follow along, like and subscribe. And, you can always reach out to me, Chris at keystotheshop.com, if you have questions about things. If you're interested in consulting or coaching for yourself and your team, your coffee shop, this is what I do full time. I want to make sure that you know about our key holder coaching groups. At the time of this recording, I think there's still a little bit of time left for you to apply for key holder coaching groups. Now, these are curated groups, cohorts that last 6 months. This is a dedicated group of people who are building momentum and helping each other, peer-to-peer coaching in the world of cafes and coffee shops. These are 5 to 6 coffee shop owners that have experience of at least 2 years under their belts. We've got lots of different levels of experience and flavors of cafes coming together in one group that over 6 months, it's a big commitment, but it's really powerful. We've done 4 cohorts so far. We're getting ready to do the 5th one now. And every time I do one of these, I'm the host of these, facilitator of this cohort of people. We see a lot of change that happens both in the world of the owner, but also in the world of their business. So the business improves, the peace of mind and clarity improves for the owners that are involved in this, the perspectives that you gain from being in this group, the key holder coaching groups, is amazing. So if you're wanting to invest in yourself, invest in your business, and also help your fellow coffee shop owners at the same time, then this group is something that you should explore. So check out the show notes. We have a link to the application, and you and I will get to have a conversation and see if this is the right fit for you. There's still time to send your application in. So go ahead and do that. You can also check out keystotheshop.com, and on the website, you can look at the testimonials from past members just by clicking on coaching groups over on the tab on top of the website. So thanks, everybody. Now, today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Arto Brick and also the Pacific Barista series. I'm going to talk more about them later on in the episode, but I want to introduce our guest today and tell you a little bit about what's going on with La Palma y el Tucán in Colombia. We are talking today with Felipe Sardi. Now, Felipe is the founder and CEO of El Green Hub. It's a business ecosystem that's dedicated to environmental regeneration and sustainability and innovation within the specialty coffee value chain. It has operations in multiple countries, brings together companies that span coffee production, international trade, retail, and financial services. And they're all about empowering small-scale producers across Latin America through sustainable practices and making the financial part inclusive. So it's financial inclusion as well. The goal there, of course, is to drive meaningful economic and social change in the farming communities, in the rural communities. So that whole journey there at El Green Hub started with La Palma y el Tucán, which is a small farm in Cundinamarca that transformed in degraded land into a thriving ecosystem where specialty coffee flourishes alongside of biodiversity. And so this whole project, it proved that regenerative agriculture works. And it has inspired many different business models that have grown into significant enterprises across coffee and agriculture sectors. So the idea of regenerative farming, using the soil, using the land, and investing into true sustainability, that is what they're about. And Felipe himself was born and raised in Colombia, came from an entrepreneurial family, and developed a deep appreciation for hard work, innovation, and purpose-driven business. He graduated from Los Nogales High School in Bogota and went to earn a bachelor's in finance at Tulane University in New Orleans. And his whole career has been a big commitment to sustainable agriculture. And that led him to pursue a graduate certificate in agricultural sciences from the University of Melbourne and a permaculture design certificate from Permaculture Research Institute in Australia. So the roots run deep with Felipe and the projects that they have going on at La Palma y el Tucán. You'll recognize that name of coffee because that is a coffee that many competitors across the world have used in their routines. They are responsible for the lactic fermentation process. They are also responsible for what is called the bio-innovative process that uses the microorganisms in the soil for fermentation. And this conversation with Felipe is all about regenerative farming, the bio-innovative process, investing deeper into what you have around you in the soil, really doubling down on terroir. And we're going to talk a lot about that in this conversation, but just also figuring out ways that we in the world of coffee in the consuming countries can walk alongside and partner with people who are doing this kind of work on the farm level to invest in their future. And of course, I think a lot of us who read the headlines about what's happening on the farm level and the crisis that's faced daily by so many farmers would definitely want to know what is it that we can be doing every day in the way that we run our business that will help and give momentum to the kind of work that people are doing, like Felipe and the team there in Colombia. So I'm excited to have Felipe on the show. It's really an honor, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation with Felipe Sardi. Felipe, welcome to Keys to the Shop. What an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Chris. The honor is all mine. Thank you.
Well, we were talking a little bit here and thinking about the enormity of the subject of coffee farming and the subject that we talk about a lot in the industry, but a lot of us don't have a full grasp of. We have little bits and pieces of understanding. And I think most of us today, in today's coffee industry, especially, let's say, call it post-third wave coffee people, have a very deep desire to make a difference. Now, you're no different. You've made a difference and are making a difference with what you're doing on the farm.
Thank you.
And I'm excited for what we're going to dive into here today. So I'm kind of wanting to start from the beginning of how you decided to found your project and begin this project in the first place. Was this something that had been on your mind and on your heart for a while, and you finally found the right path to take? And it was in 2013, I know, when this was all founded. But give us an inside story as to how this all kind of unfurled for you.
Thank you, Chris, of course. So it goes back to 2012, actually, that we purchased the farm with my wife. It was a cattle farm in Colombia, in the middle of Colombia, near Bogota. But it actually didn't begin there. It began years back in 2008 when I was trading coffee, specialty coffee, actually, in Miami for the United States. And we went bankrupt. Pretty much simple. We had to close the business, unfortunately, because of the financial crisis. Some of our big clients went down and we had to file for Chapter 11, then eventually Chapter 7. And, I was in debt up to my eyeballs. I had to go back to Colombia and repay the debt while working in different industries for a few years. But in my heart, I had this passion, this feeling that I needed to go back into coffee, but not the same type of commodity trading coffee business that I had, but actually something that added value to producers, to the consumers, and everybody in between. And that's why we decided with my wife back in 2012 to buy this cattle farm, somehow challenging ourselves that we could convert a cattle farm, completely compacted soil, into basically a coffee sanctuary, which I think we finally did many years after. and enter the specialty coffee business by offering a lot of value, not only from a sensorial perspective, but also adding value in the community, basically by working with hundreds of families around us, offering the services of co-fermentation with them, commercialization of their coffees. And so we did. And that's a beautiful journey that has, ups and downs, as every entrepreneurial journey, but it has been amazing.
When you started this, you obviously saw a need. And I'm curious if you could articulate what that need was. There's a good opportunity, but what was the need that you saw that made you think this is a good opportunity, that difference needs to be made? What was the problem you were trying to solve, and what was the need in the industry you saw?
I still see that need, and it's basically, how do we decommoditize a commodity, the second most traded commodity in the world? How can we actually, knowing that it's the most complex, chemically speaking, food in the world, how is it that we will leverage that and decommoditize, one of these huge commodities that has such an impact in millions of lives around the world? That challenge basically meant that we had to solve a problem that the industry, I think, was struggling on how to add value on a commodity. And we saw an opportunity. We saw an opportunity primarily through one of the main variables of producing specialty coffee. So I always like to think about three pillars, right? Terroir, the land, what the land offers you, basically the same as in wine and so many other agricultural products. You pretty much can choose a terroir. You can sort of work with the terroir, but it's very difficult to change the terroir, right? Unless, of course, you start thinking long-term, which definitely is one. Then the second variable, which is genetics, right? Genetics you can also work with, as the same as in wine. You can choose genetics, you can adapt genetics. But then there's a third one, which is the processing variable. And this is the opportunity that we saw, that not many people were, actually targeting the processing variable to offer value in the coffee trade. So we decided that we were going to use this terroir that was getting better year after year, that we were going to use some genetics, both traditional, Colombian Castilla varieties, as well as, some of the Arabica varieties, but that we were really going to make a difference, adding value in the processing variable at the fermentation level. And that's what we chose. And I think it paid off really well. And we opened doors to magnificent profiles that maybe the industry at the moment hadn't experienced.
When you started, did you start with the bio-innovative process that you're known for, or was that something that developed as you did the experiments?
It developed as we did the experiments. The first, maybe famous, I would say, process that we actually used to won the World Barista Championship with Yu Young back in 2019, and that has been, there from the very beginning, was called the lactic acid process. And it basically was the result of a mistake. We left some bag of coffee cherries back in the wet mill, because usually what you do, Chris, is you take the coffee cherries, or what you used to do as traditionally in the industry, and you have to depulp that fairly soon. Then you wash the coffee and you dry it. But we left some of those bags by mistake behind a door for more than 72 hours. So it basically created an anaerobic fermentation with a pulp. And we said, what the heck, let's try to process the whole thing and see what it does. And we decided to call that lactic process. That was basically our first derivation from the traditional, washed processes, as it created this lactic acidity, this mouthfeel like it was a strawberry yogurt. Really, really interesting. And we started to play with that. And eventually we reached other processes like that bio-innovation, which is one of my favorite many years later.
When you started to realize that this was something that was pleasant and you started to market it, what was the response to that particular, to the lactic acid, for example? What was the response to that? And do you feel that that's something that people were kind of looking for but couldn't find as often as they would like to have?
Yeah, that's a great question. We had two types of responses. From the traditional purists, we had a bit of rejection. Of course, what are you doing? This is not the way that we process coffees in the country. It's been over 100 years that we've been depulping, washing, drying. Of course, we had doubts whether we could export that coffee, and we later realized that we couldn't under the Colombian coffee category. Eventually, we sort of looked at different ways, but that was the first response. It was, you shouldn't be doing this, guys. But then the market, the roasters, they were actually very curious about a different profile. At the beginning, it was all experimentation. It was a bit irresponsible. And this is something that we should talk about, because innovation without science, without data, without discipline is, in my opinion, irresponsible. It later became consistent, but it took us a lot of effort. But yeah, so the market was demanding different profiles, experimentation methods. And at the time, we had that demand for the coffee, and it sold very quickly. So that was the other response, a lot of acceptance on the roaster side of the industry.
Yeah, I'll put my cards on the table and say I'm a certified old head when it comes to coffee and traditional things. And there have been various processes that are, we would say, with air quotes, experimental. Although today you might argue that it's a lot more commonplace to find, thanks to the work that you've done and others also in the space that are disciplined in pursuing this innovation. But when it comes to how this process creates an inroad to decommoditize coffee, I'm curious how you envision this being a means to accomplish that goal.
So basically, by using those three variables, primarily the processing side of the variable, you add value to the sensorial characteristics of the coffee. Not necessarily because it's a better coffee. It doesn't mean that it's a better coffee to another. It's just a different coffee that is consistently different. If you're able to consistently produce, for instance, a lactic mouthfeel-like aftertaste, if you're able to consistently produce sweetness with, well-balanced cup of coffees using the same process, I think you add a lot of value through a different experience that the market is willing to pay for. Mm-hmm. So basically, the value at the end comes, at the end of the consumer willing to pay additional money for an experience that is not easy to find, but that is consistent. When you go and ask for a lactic acid process coffee, you usually find this type of profile. And if you do, it's exciting and the industry acknowledges it.
Yeah. What do you think about the consistency conversation? It seems like because there's infrastructure for the hundreds of years that things have been done for, traditional means of processing, that there is more consistency there. Although I'm fairly certain that that's not always the case. In coffee, there's inconsistency in anything. But it feels like there might be a little bit more so with things that are emerging. What does it look like to have a disciplined pursuit of consistency when it comes to these innovative processes?
Chris, that's a really relevant question. And I usually now, after many years in the industry, look at this question from two perspectives. So from the perspective of the buyer, of course, you want to try new things, exciting things. Hopefully these things, co-fermentations or long hour fermentations can excite your palate. That's a great, perspective. But then I also watch it from the perspective of the producers of the origin. And that's a different perspective. You've got to be responsible there. Not only in the innovations at the processing plant, but also, even when you think about changing the genetics, wiping out a Timor hybrid, which is resistant to rust, and changing it for geisha, that has huge implications in terms of responsibility towards the coffee growing community. Then washing the coffee, or doing a lactic process or an anaerobic 100-hour process as opposed to a regular wash, that also has a huge implication on the coffee processor if it goes wrong. So when you ask that question, I think absolutely, tradition has a huge play in being responsible with over 12 billion coffee growers around the world. In a sense, that not everybody is ready to innovate, right? And if you know that if you take that cherry, you process it in a certain way, you wash it in a certain way, you get a profile, that's great. You should continue to focus there. And maybe just take, 10% if you're really willing to innovate and explore, hopefully by doing some research before and preparing with 10% of your harvest. But not anything crazy that will be, again, irresponsible. So yeah, I agree with you. I think we should still push the limits, but we should be responsible when doing so.
It feels like pushing the limits is an addition, giving people additional options. And as long as there's consistency in a consistent market, like you say, that's a responsible way to do it. But it's not against traditional methods. So to innovate another way of doing things is not to say that the old way of doing things is old in the sense that it's bad, I would imagine.
Absolutely. It's complementary. I am a purist. I love my washed Colombians, and of course, it depends on what the industry is demanding, but it doesn't mean that it's conflicting. It's complementary. we should try to offer a diversity of options from the world's most complex food, which is, again, amazing. Just to give you an example, Chris, on how we do it. So when I talk to you about responsibility, what we did is we did a huge investment in the processing plant. So we can actually process coffee from 200 small-scale farmers around us. We have people who are dedicated to the microbiology of the fermentation. So basically, we extract specific parameters and samples, and we send them to a lab in Bogota. It's a microbial biochemistry lab to basically understand, what that process in the fermentation has in terms of microbiology. Then we try to replicate that in later processes, and actually we also try to identify specific microorganisms that are creating a particular profile, bioaugment them, and send them back into the tank. So my point is, we work with a science-based approach to be able to achieve consistency in the experimentations, and that requires innovation, investment. So we do not put this burden or this risk on the small-scale farmers. We collaborate with them. They provide the fruit. We ferment that, and then we create a product together. I think that approach has helped us somehow in distributing risks and getting beautiful results.
I mean, it's excited the coffee industry, no doubt. And people, you've mentioned the competition stage. Some very well-known roasters around the world use the product, and these coffees are noticeably different, of course. And I'm curious about the demand from the market being one based on novelty versus the helpful nature of the consistency of demand. So if somebody says, I'm really interested in this new thing, the idea of a new process, and once it's not new and once it's established, or it's this the lactic process you were talking about before, once it's new and established, or it's the new washed coffee, right? Will they be and do you worry about people just demanding more and more forward-moving new things and leaving what was innovated before in the dust? And so we're in a perpetual cycle of innovation where maybe sometimes innovation is not necessary.
Yeah, that's a great, tricky question. But again, to my point of responsibility, think about it. I'm going to try to give a couple of examples from the cafe perspective as well, from a coffee shop.
Yeah.
So I know that most of the coffee that you serve have to be consistent, good quality, maybe blends for the milk-based coffees. But when you think about these innovations, I usually try to put them at the top of the pyramid, as if they were just validations of something that could be consistently good, right? So we're trying to showcase something that the industry would like to validate. But there's a lot of rejections, and that's fine. That's part of the innovation process. So, for example, let's say that you're a coffee shop and 90% of what you buy, from a washed or a method that you feel very comfortable with for your blends. But then you decide to try something interestingly new, innovative, a bit daring, to see how your customers react. And whether they like it or not, it will help you build your next decision on what to buy. And that also provides us producers with a lot of valuable feedback, because this is essential, to communicate and ask my clients, how did they receive this particular profile? Is it something that we should explore to put into our portfolio? No. So it's a feedback that creates, from innovation, creates consistency for the future. I think it's a safe play.
It's almost as though you're replanting your coffee when you send the coffee to the roaster, and then they plant it into the market. And they're the ones who have to figure out the microbial makeup of their customers' reception of this thing. Like, what grows from the brewing and enjoying of coffee, and how can we adjust it? It's kind of a full circle moment. So the taste of the consumers sometimes will be like, I never want to taste that again. Or that's all I want to taste the rest of my life. And it's a mix. But so much of the consumers, when we say consumer, a lot of us think of the global north, and we think of the consumers that are traditional. But what I've noticed in the many years of doing this podcast and just in coffee in general is the continuing growth of in-country consumption, and sometimes prioritizing the processing of coffee and the growing of coffee, not for the traditional consumers, but in equal parts or even more so for those roasting and serving coffee in Colombia, for example. Have you seen that? Well, how does that play into the decisions that you make?
Yeah, it's a great point. I've seen a lot of movement, dynamics changing ever since we entered this farming space back in 2012 to today, Chris. I can attest that it has been a massive increase. There's been a massive increase in interest locally for good quality coffee. So actually, you can see this in Brazil, which in my opinion is the origin country that has the most developed internal market for specialty coffee consumption. Colombia, you're seeing that as well in Central America, Costa Rica, Mexico even. But just to give you an idea, we many years ago founded a small coffee chain that's called Libertario Coffee Roasters, with the idea to basically leave great coffees for the Colombians to taste, because we were exporting everything abroad. And, this is respectable and this is great, but we were looking at an internal market that was drinking, in my opinion, very low quality coffee, but that didn't have access to specialty coffee, but was willing to pay for it. So we started developing this brand for internal coffee consumption, and it has become now an amazing business that helps us validate, if we're doing things right, to then serve other more developed markets. Because the reality is that there are some markets like the United States, like Australia, like Korea, and also Taiwan, some markets in Europe that are ahead of the curve, and their expectations are now different than what I call the underserved emerging markets, where we are also operating. So it's a process. You sort of validate your product, and then if it's ready and it's highly accepted, then you offer it to the more developed markets.
Hey everybody, it's Chris, and I wanted to take a moment here to say, first, I hope you're enjoying the episode. Second, I want to talk to you about our sponsors. We are so happy to be sponsored today by two amazing companies. First, let's talk about Arto Brick. Arto is a place that is producing amazing tile, stonework, and hard surfaces for residential and commercial projects. If you can dream it, they can make it. I have been through their factory, their facility. They grind and form and make and paint and glaze, and it's all made on site in Los Angeles. It's amazing. I'm going to be putting up some videos about, what I saw there and the work they do. It really is a craft, and something that if you have it in your cafe, you could be really proud that this is something made with love. So go ahead and follow them on Instagram at Arto Brick. If you're looking for a partner to help you realize your dreams and create a unique design in your cafe, then Arto Brick has to be the partner that you put on that list. So again, check them out at Arto Brick. Now, we're also sponsored by our friends at the Pacific Barista Series. Now, that is the line of plant-based performance beverages that is designed from the ground up to be all about barista success, coffee shop success. If you are looking for something that your customers can depend on and love, this is it, because it is something that stands up to the heat from steaming. It produces great texture for latte art and, just a great coffee experience. It's balanced. It's focused on the coffee. It's not overwhelming. It's balanced because it's designed to perform in specialty coffee environments. And so check them out at pacificfoodservice.com. You can get samples, try it for yourself. I highly encourage you to do so. You're going to taste and then see, it's great stuff. So thank you to our friends over at Pacific Barista Series. Check them out again at the pacificfoodservice.com website. Now back to our episode with Felipe Sardi. So the thing that really is, maybe I would say, hopeful about all of that is the idea that for a long time, when you go to the SCA, when you go to talk about what's happening in coffee right now, the crisis for farmers is at the foremost of people's minds. And maybe it should be more so in a lot of people's minds. I'd say a lot of people that are here that run coffee shops, they're just trying to keep their coffee shop open, but they are still concerned and they want to know what to do and how. When we talk about in-country consumption and we talk about the scientific and disciplined pursuit of innovation, it sounds like those are types of things that are actually very much shifting the balance of power a little bit more evenly in the value stream. So I'm curious your opinion on this, and maybe, educate us a little bit more in depth rather than just a bird's eye view that we have from coffee shops elsewhere, from where you sit. What's actually happening and what's actually making a difference?
Yeah, so my perspective on that is actually a bit fatalistic, or I would say realistic, in the sense that I'm living every day the struggles that small-scale farmers have to deal with. I know it's a subject that the industry has been considering for many years, but the end of the matter is that we haven't been able to resolve it sustainably. So what I see, Chris, to answer your question, are small-scale farmers that are aging. So it's an aging population with labor scarcity, and we'll talk about this very soon, the reasons why there's labor scarcity in origin, with climate change challenging their methodology and their terroirs every year, with input costs going up, and then the volatility. The fact that the prices are up is amazing, but then they're down and they're up again, and so that doesn't give you any vision, any stability. And all these factors are playing against small-scale farmers who, depending on who you ask, can be between 12 million, only producing coffee, to all the way to 20 million producing coffee and other things. I think most of them will not make it, will lose the battle. If you think about it, inheritance, for instance, when you have to split your farm to 3 or 4 children who actually, most of them don't want to have it, that's already a smaller productive unit from the one that their parents had, which is a different struggle. You also have to consider that input costs are going up and the storms are washing off your soil. So that's another big challenge that I'm seeing. People do not want to get into farming in origin. So I definitely see that we should change the model, and that we should do it with the roaster side, with the demand side. So I'm going to give you an example of what I see possible doing. Let's think for a minute that monocultures, and by monocultures I mean coffee farms that only have coffee trees, right? So you can have between 3,000 to 10,000 coffee trees per hectare, depending on where you are, how technology oriented you are, etc. But let's think for a minute that we change monocultures into polycultures, into agroforests, into systems that look like forests that also grow coffee. So then you say, well, what does this have to do with roasters and clients? It has to do that it has a lot of potential to tell stories around the transition, the resilience, the conversion of that ecosystem. It also has to do a lot with quality. I don't know if you know this, but there's been studies that actually show that climate change is affecting the floral characteristics of coffee. Mm-hmm. The amount of water that is falling is affecting the sensorial characteristics of the coffee just by washing out sugars from the cherry. So we, as an industry, we can build a system that has a lot more stories to tell, that will produce polycultures that are resilient and that are, help farmers diversify income, increase income, and also have great coffees.
Yeah. And so this becomes, you said polyculture, there is a lot of income streams coming from the same plot of land. I've heard bio or ecotourism is what a lot of people do, as well as the production of different fruits and agricultural products. And I'm kind of curious also regarding the responsible approach to applying these techniques to a farm. If somebody listening has influence in the say of how we innovate in our farm next year, they say, well, we're just going to start doing different processing methods. We're going to start down the path of what Felipe is saying here. Is there a wrong way to do that such that it doesn't actually take is there a length of time that you would expect to see a return on the investment of doing that, or an order in which it naturally should happen to become sort of this biodynamic and healthy polyculture farming entity?
After many years of trying and failing, Chris, I can tell you experiences where, for instance, I started doing polycultures, or basically cross-cropping, offering different crops to coffee farmers in Tolima, in the south of Colombia, in Huila, also in the north of Colombia, and I failed terribly. Just to give you some examples, I did crossing coffee with red kidney beans, right? So basically beans. I also did cassava, which is, of course, the starch plant, very famous. I also did canadulis, which is a local plant as well for flour. We intercropped other stuff, and we actually did vermicomposting with Californian worms to degrade organic matter from the farms, and we failed. And the reason why we failed is, I think, in retrospective, Chris, that we started with medium to long-term transition processes. So what I realized is that we should build on the short-term processes that affect the variable number one in farming, which is soil. So you address the soil first. You do not address the forest or the canopy or the polyculture first. That's secondary. That comes later. You address the soil first. And by that, I realized, for instance, that the biochar project that we have with thousands of small-scale farmers, which is a short-term approach to improving soil, is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to begin with. So just to give you an idea of how it works, think about a coffee farm producing a lot of coffee from 3 or 4 different plots. And each plot eventually has to be pruned down and be replaced because productivity will top and then will plateau and then it will go down. When you replace that amount of coffee trees, usually what coffee growers do is they take 10 to 20% of that as firewood. And the rest is left behind decomposing in the field, not even used for composting. So what we realized is that we could use those trunks, that availability of biomass, to produce biochar, which is a charcoal that you pyrolyze. You pyrolyze the wood basically within an anaerobic environment, no oxygen, high temperatures above 500 degrees. You create like a foam, which is a charcoal, very light charcoal that produces beautiful results for the soil. Then you plant them into the soil. And then not only that the soil improves in many, many different ways, but they're actually also giving us support through carbon credits, Chris. Because 75% of that carbon is carbon that will remain there for 1,000 years. So the permanence of the carbon that you fix through biochar is very interesting for the markets. And it also helps farmers increase a lot of the characteristics that the soil needs to be better. So I would definitely, back to your question, begin with short-term gains on the soil first, build on soil composting, vermicomposting, for the next harvest, biochar production. And then my next move would be to look at the crops and eventually to create a polyculture 7 years down the road.
And this biochar process is something that's achievable by virtually anybody with a coffee farm, I assume.
Absolutely. It is simple. There's a lot of YouTube videos out there, techniques. Of course, we try to do it with, very professional contikis. They're called kilns that are also artisanal in a way that you can take them to each farm. So these are not centralized big units, but rather small contikis that go to the farm. We teach growers how to convert their coffee prunings into biochar, then how to apply the biochar. And what biochar does, just to give you an example, is it improves the characteristics of the soil. So it basically softens the soil so that the roots can explore better. It increases something that we call the cationic exchange capacity of the soil. It's nothing else than, think of it as a magnet. Yeah. It attracts cations, right? So the negative ions or the anions of the biochar attract the cations from the fertilizer. So basically, you improve the yield just by applying biochar. It retains much, much more water than its own weight, Chris. And it actually also hosts microorganisms because it protects them. So it's, from a technology and cost perspective, it's a high-end technology, very cost-effective, that has a huge impact in soils. And then in addition to that, we sell the carbon credits, and most of that is also given back to the farmers. So it increases income, it diversifies risks, it saves you money as a farmer, it improves soil. It's just amazing, I think.
That's wonderful. So in a lot of ways, you are not only doing this as a means of creating fruitfulness with your own projects, but the educational process, the example that it gives to the industry. You're very connected. People are listening to a podcast or watching this on YouTube, and they've seen the competition stage and they follow on social media. So the example of someone who's doing innovation is not just for the sake of their own farm, but it also has a downstream effect in this kind of a domino effect in the industry. That's pretty awesome. And so I'm kind of curious about the other process that you've got, the bio-innovative process, and especially using the terroir of the soil itself. And then I have a follow-up question when we hear about this bio-innovative process, but I'd love to explore the process itself. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So to think about that process, first we have to understand fermentation from a simple perspective of 3 phases. So fermentation is basically turning sugars into ethanol, organic acids, and and CO2, right? Or basically gases. And you can do that with many fruits, but the way that you do that can vary. You could actually use an enzymatic approach, basically use the enzymes that the fruits produce or that the microorganisms produce to try to modulate controlled fermentation. You can also do just microbial activity fermentation and think the microbiology that's going on there has a huge effect on the fermentation. And you should think about which microorganisms should coexist or not and try to control. That's another pathway. Or you can use also, for instance, pH buffers to try to give some of the microorganisms and some of the enzymes more time to convert pectins and polysaccharides into the organic acids that we love. What we usually think about is how can we prioritize microorganisms from our own native soils. So basically the second route, so that they have a specific personality imprinted into that coffee through us helping them, through the process. So you think about how microbiology plays in fermentation, and usually if you go to the beer industry or to the wine industry, they would buy external inputs. Most farms, even coffee now, even some coffee farms are buying external inputs, or basically yeasts and some external agents that they buy in a solid state, then 10 to the 11th power, then they put into the tanks, whatever, to try to achieve standardization in that fermentation through microbiology. But I think that's a mistake. Why I think that is because in our terroirs, in our soils, as coffee growers, we have so much life, so much microbiology, so much richness, which we should look into that first, try to see which microorganisms are playing a role in a great fermentation, try to separate, bioaugment them, and then inoculate them back in the tank. So as opposed to buying them from the industry abroad, we should actually look into our terroir, into our soil, with a science-based approach, of course, and then try to do that. And this is exactly what bioinnovation does. It looks at microorganisms that are present in our farm, in the leaves from our trees, in the soils from our lands, in the trunks, in every place in our farm. And we try to determine which of them have a specific role in the fermentation. We bioaugment them, and then we put them back in the fermentation. And of course, these have a science-based professional approach, but it's also somehow artisanal. In the same way that a grower would add yeast to the tank, this behaves in the same way, but it has a different profile result. And this is an invitation for farmers to think on their ecosystem first before receiving external inputs. And this is what really bioinnovation is, a statement that you can do great things within your own terroir before you look out.
I love it. Can I just say that you can do great things within your own terroir could apply to coffee shops as well as coffee farms. We tend to externalize our solutions before we explore fully what is in front of us and go deep into the solutions. And if you have to, then you have to. But because of our connection to everything else, sometimes we leave a lot of potential in the soil that we're standing on. The follow-up question to this was, because innovation in processing is so popular right now, especially around the competition circuit and, auctions and so forth, I've heard a lot of people talk about terroir as being a misnomer or something that, we don't necessarily need. But what I'm hearing is that terroir can be used for the processing, and it can be something that, as you say, it imprints on the coffee. That would be something that's very unique for your farm, for your coffee in your area. And I would worry that if everybody was buying and trading and flying in yeasts and things, eventually all coffee from all places would taste the same and the individuality wouldn't be there. Some folks would say that's actually good, because then those without an advantage in the market would get an advantage. But I'm curious what you would say to that argument and where terroir's place is in the future of coffee.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think terroir is one of the critical variables in the present and in the future of coffee. And we are underestimating it because, in my opinion, we do not understand, and I include myself in it. We don't understand it enough as maybe the industry, in the wine industry, has understood it after so many years of research. But I think there's a huge potential in terroir, not only in adapting to what's coming, but also in modulating with consistency, because it doesn't mean that we can still, from a farm level, not be consistent. The demand that the industry is asking from the farm. So terroir is an unknown. It's an amazing variable that has a lot to offer, from the microbial activity to the type of soils and their interaction with the roots in terms of nutrients that are present or not in a specific terroir, to the amount of sunlight and waterfall that it receives, to the shade that it has or it hasn't, to the biology that it inhabits in that terroir. There's so much to offer, and it's so complex that I think that's going to be, at least in our future, one of the variables that we're going to be exploring with the most. So just to get back to your original statement, which I respect and I agree, it's a matter of balancing the three: the terroir, the genetics, and the processing. Because otherwise you could grow coffee as they are growing now, that we'll continue to do in greenhouses, right? So if you grow coffee in greenhouses, which is fine, and you could have the same cherry, or literally physically the same cherry, and then process it in a different way, you could argue that you don't need terroir. But I think it's because we are not looking at all the complexity and all the variables that terroir can offer in the final cup. So this is going to be a field of exploration for us, Chris, in the future. I hope it's going to be exciting. I'm going to share everything with the social media.
Beautiful. And the idea, of course, in and of itself means that you're always going to keep the soil as the foremost thing to focus on. So it's another reason to keep focusing on where you are, how to be responsible steward of the land and the soil. And it keeps innovation, undisciplined innovation, let's say, in check.
Yeah.
Because there are certain things you can't rush. You have to listen to the feedback from the earth and from your consumers and from the people that are the stakeholders in this whole thing. And I think that kind of leaves me into this question as we kind of round out our conversation, which is the idea of, we all, after listening, are probably going to get out of our cars and go to our shift or just pay some taxes. And who knows what these listeners here at Keys to the Shop we're all doing. But we need to have some kind of a North Star to guide our own actions, to, even from a distance, walk side by side with people like yourself and the farmers you represent, to make a difference with the platforms we have. What do you find yourself recommending people do most often that will make a bigger difference than anything else?
Interact. I mean, the technology tools that we have today are amazing. Of course, traveling would be ideal. Traveling to origin, visiting us, understanding where we come from, both the needs and expectations of the producers would be great. But if traveling is not always an option, it's not always an option. Using the technology tools like these amazing podcasts and so many other tools to connect with what's happening at origin. So basically, one of the invitations I have, and I would really like to explore this, Chris, soon, is that we co-create with roasters and cafe owners the next processes. So it's no longer, we produce, we create, and then you decide whether that's good or not for your business, but actually co-create. So basically creating together, what the profile is, how we can modulate this variable or the other one together to achieve a profile that you really like, that it's going to be unique. I think that technology is going to allow us, producers and consumers, to get together and co-create the next coffee wave. And this is something I'm investing in, and I will be launching something soon. It's a pilot project, but that should be, in my opinion, where we should work together much, much closer for the next wave of coffee.
Love it. Felipe, it's been wonderful to talk to you. Can you tell us where we should stay tuned and plugged into online to just be informed and follow along with the innovations that you're pursuing?
Thank you, Chris. The pleasure has been all mine. Please follow the Instagram account, La Palma y el Tucán, if you're interested in what we're going to be doing. Also, we have the LinkedIn account and a website that we're building. Just to give you a little hint of what's coming, I'm going to be playing with music frequencies in the drying areas. I'm going to be playing with new microbial activities from the terroirs and showing you how they affect, in a way or another, the final profile. And I would love your feedback to improve, again, to work together in what is going to be the exciting world of coffee in the future.
That's really interesting. Wow. Well, again, thank you, Felipe. It was a pleasure having you on here. Honored.
Thank you, Chris. Likewise. It was my honor. Thank you. Have a beautiful day.
Okay, everybody. Well, I really hope that you enjoyed that episode. I would encourage you to get plugged into everything they have going on there at the farm level. You know what? You can follow them on Instagram, La Palma EL Tucán. That's on Instagram at La Palma EL Tucán. You can also find their coffees available through many different roasters, probably a roaster near you. So I would invite you to Google search, And we had an episode where we interviewed someone else from La Palma y El Tucán, and that was Sebastian Villamizar, who runs Futura Coffee Roasters. So you might want to order from them as well. But really get plugged into the journey and what's happening on the farm level, where people are investing into the local agriculture, the local soil, and creating something unique to that area. I really enjoy that idea, and that conversation today was fantastic and inspiring. So always looking for ways to highlight and promote and walk alongside of, add momentum to that work that creates a better future for coffee farmers. So huge thank you to Felipe for joining us on the show, and all of the hard work, consistency, and investment that you and your team have put into making the world of coffee a more sustainable and equitable place. So if you have any questions or comments about today's episode, feel free to send me an email, chris@keystotheshop.com. You can also find the reel of this episode on Instagram and add your comments there. You can start a conversation. That's great. DM me on Instagram @keystotheshop. You also can reach out to that email, chris@keystotheshop.com. If you're interested in keyholder coaching groups, our cohort of coffee shop owners, a group dedicated to mutual success in coffee shops and in the world of coffee shop leadership. That is starting at the end of September, kind of beginning of October. So you have time to actually apply still to be a member of this group. We're in our 5th cohort now, and I'd love to have a conversation with you. So reach out and let's have a conversation while applications are still open. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Thank you so much. Remember, check out our friends at La Palma y El Tucán, and just keep on representing coffee very well in the work you do behind the bar. There are so many people behind each cup of coffee, so many people counting on you, dialing in well, engaging the customer, communicating well. And it's a great honor for us to do the work we do in the coffee shops. And so let's never forget that. Let's let that help sustain us in the highs and the lows and the emotional and physical labor that it is to be coffee shop professionals. I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. And as always, I truly hope that this episode has given you keys to the shop.